In October of 1923, a maintenance crew digging a new drainage trench along the eastern foundation of Ridgeline State Asylum in western North Carolina struck something roughly 4 feet down that was not soil, not rock, and not anything the crew's foreman, a man named Otis Pruitt, had a ready explanation for. He stopped the dig. He sent a runner up to the main building to fetch the institution's superintendent. And by the time the sun went down that evening, what had started as a routine drainage project had become something else entirely. The first thread in a story that the asylum's own administration spent the better part of the next year trying to control, and that researchers, a century later, are still trying to fully untangle. This is the story of what they found, and what they did about it, and what it tells us about an institution that had, by 1923, already been quietly burying more than its dead. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who needs to know what's underneath a story before you can trust the surface of it, stay with me, because what was found at Ridgeline in October of 1923 was only the beginning of what that excavation eventually uncovered. Drop a comment and tell me what you think they found. I want to see your guesses before I tell you what the record actually shows. Our story begins in 1887, the year Ridgeline State Asylum opened in a remote valley in the mountains of western North Carolina, built to serve a region whose geography had, for decades, made it nearly impossible for the state to provide any institutional mental health care at all. The mountains that surrounded the asylum site were the same mountains that had made the region's roads nearly impassable for half the year, that had kept communities isolated from each other and from the rest of the state, and that had meant, for the families living in those hollows, that a relative suffering from severe mental illness, or epilepsy, or any of the conditions the era grouped under that broad umbrella had, before Ridgeline opened, essentially nowhere to go. The asylum's founding superintendent, a physician named Dr. Walton Ferris, understood this isolation as both the justification for the institution's existence and, eventually, as the condition that would let it operate for decades with almost no meaningful outside oversight. Ridgeline opened with capacity for 200 patients, and, like nearly every comparable institution we've covered on this channel, exceeded that capacity within its first 15 years, reaching a population of just under 600 by 1910, in a facility whose physical plant had been expanded only incrementally to accommodate the growth. The institution's burial practices, established in its earliest years, followed the standard pattern of the era: a cemetery on the property's northern slope for patients who died during their commitment and whose families either could not be located or declined to claim the remains. By 1923, that cemetery held, according to the partial ledger that survives, somewhere around 400 documented burials spanning the institution's 36 years of operation. What Otis Pruitt's crew found in October of 1923 was not in the cemetery. It was roughly 200 yards from the cemetery's northern boundary, along the asylum's eastern foundation, in a section of ground that had never been designated for burial in any surviving institutional document. What they found, when the excavation was carefully expanded under the supervision of the county coroner, who was summoned the following morning, was a set of human remains, ultimately determined to be at least 11 distinct individuals, buried without coffins, without markers, and without any apparent ceremony, at a depth and in a configuration that the coroner's report, filed 3 weeks later, described as inconsistent with standard institutional burial practice as documented elsewhere on this property. The coroner, a man named Dr. Lucius Hartwell, who had served the county for over 20 years and who had, by his own account in correspondence preserved in the county archive, never previously had cause to investigate anything connected to the asylum, approached the discovery with what his surviving notes suggest was genuine professional caution. His preliminary examination of the remains, conducted on-site over the following several days, estimated that the individuals had been buried at some point between approximately 1900 and 1915, based on the condition of the remains and a small number of associated artifacts, fragments of institutional clothing, in several cases, that matched patterns used at Ridgeline during that period. Hartwell's report does not speculate about cause of death for any of the 11 individuals, noting explicitly that the remains had deteriorated to a point where such determination was not possible through the examination methods available to him in 1923. What Hartwell's report does establish, in language that researchers studying this case have returned to repeatedly, is the central, unresolved question that gives this story its weight. There is no surviving institutional record, no admission log, no death certificate, no burial ledger entry that accounts for any of these 11 individuals. They do not appear in Ridgeline's documented cemetery population. They do not appear in any surviving discharge or transfer record from the relevant period. As far as the asylum's own official paper trail is concerned, these 11 people simply do not exist. Before we get to how the institution responded, I want to stay a moment longer with Coroner Hartwell, because his role in this story is more significant than the brief mention of his report might suggest. Lucius Hartwell had served as county coroner since 1901, and his surviving casebook, a personal ledger he kept throughout his career, separate from his official county filings, donated by his family to the Regional Archive in 1967, shows a man who took his role with considerable seriousness, documenting cases in far more narrative detail than his official reports typically allowed. His entry for the October 1923 discovery, found in this personal casebook rather than in his official county filing, is considerably more candid than the language of his formal report. I have examined many things in 22 years in this position, Hartwell wrote, in an entry dated 3 days after the initial discovery. But I confess, I have not previously examined anything that left me feeling I had uncovered, not an accident or a crime in the ordinary sense, but a kind of institutional carelessness, so sustained that it amounts to something I do not have a proper word for. 11 people, no names, no markers, buried with what appears to have been some care taken to place them in an orderly fashion, which tells me whoever did this was not acting in panic or haste, but was, rather, simply going about a task they considered ordinary. He added, in a passage that researchers have cited repeatedly, I intend to press for a fuller accounting. I do not expect the institution to welcome this. Hartwell's prediction proved correct. Superintendent at the time of the discovery was a man named Dr. Augustus Reeves, who had taken over from Ferris's immediate successor in 1919, and who, by every surviving account of his handling of the October 1923 discovery, moved with a speed and a focus that, in retrospect, suggests an institution far more concerned with controlling the narrative than with determining the truth. Reeves's correspondence with the State Board, filed within 48 hours of the initial discovery, characterizes the find as likely connected to an early informal burial practice predating proper institutional record-keeping, an explanation that, on its face, might have been plausible, except that it directly contradicts the existence of the documented, properly maintained cemetery just 200 yards away, which had been in continuous, careful use for the entire period in question. Coroner Hartwell's own correspondence, preserved separately from the official county case file, suggests he was not satisfied with Reeves's explanation, and that he pushed, in the weeks following the discovery, for a more thorough investigation. Specifically, for permission to expand the excavation to determine whether additional remains existed in the surrounding area, and for access to Ridgeline's complete admission and discharge records for the 1900 to 1915 period, which he hoped to cross-reference against the 11 sets of remains in an attempt to identify them. Reeves's response, documented in a letter dated November of 1923, declined both requests, citing patient privacy concerns regarding historical records and the institution's limited capacity to support an extended excavation given its ongoing operational needs. The county board, presented with this impasse, sided with Reeves. The excavation was closed in early December of 1923, less than 2 months after it began. The 11 sets of remains were reinterred, at the state's direction, in a section of the existing documented cemetery, given, in a final irony that researchers have noted repeatedly, a kind of posthumous inclusion in the institutional record that they had been excluded from in life. They were buried under a single shared marker, reading simply, Unknown, 1923, a date that records not when they died, but when they were found. Before we turn to the person who spent 4 decades trying to answer the question Hartwell and Reeves left unresolved, it's worth spending a little more time with Otis Pruitt, the maintenance foreman whose crew made the original discovery, because his account of that October morning is the closest thing that survives to an unmediated, in-the-moment description of what it actually felt like to find what they found. Pruitt gave a brief statement to Hartwell as part of the official investigation, preserved in the county case file, and a much longer, considerably more personal account in a letter he wrote to his adult son in 1951, 28 years after the fact, that the son donated to the regional archive decades later, alongside other family papers. Pruitt's 1951 letter describes a crew of 4 men working a routine drainage trench that had been excavated without incident for the better part of 2 days before the discovery, when one of the younger crew members, a man Pruitt identifies only as the Hensley boy, struck something with his shovel that didn't give the way soil or even rock typically gave. "We none of us knew what we were looking at first," Pruitt wrote. "It was bone, plain enough, once we'd cleared a bit more dirt away, but it took us a minute standing there before any of us said the word out loud. I sent the Hensley boy up to the main building at a run and told the other 2 not to dig another inch until somebody official told us different." What Pruitt's letter describes next is the part that researchers studying this case have found most striking, because it offers a rare glimpse into how the discovery was handled in the hours before any official process began. Pruitt describes the institution's response as immediate and, in his word, peculiar, not the urgent concern he might have expected, but a kind of controlled, almost rehearsed calm, with the superintendent himself, Dr. Reeves, arriving at the site within the hour and instructing the crew, before the coroner had even been summoned, to proceed carefully and to discuss the matter with no one outside the institution until the proper authorities had been able to assess the situation. Pruitt, 28 years later, still seemed unsettled by how quickly and how completely that instruction had been issued, before anyone, including Reeves himself, could possibly have known what the actual scope of the discovery would turn out to be. "I have thought many times since," Pruitt wrote to his son, "about how fast Dr. Reeves was to tell us to keep quiet before he had any earthly idea what we'd actually found. A man doesn't move that fast to control a story unless some part of him is already worried about what story there might be to control." Pruitt worked at Ridgeline for another 6 years after the discovery, before taking a position at a sawmill in a neighboring county, a career change he doesn't directly attribute to the events of October 1923 in his letter, but that the letter's overall tone, weary, still turning the memory over nearly 3 decades later, suggests was not entirely unconnected to it. I want to pause here and introduce you to the person who, more than anyone else connected to this story, refused to let it end there. A woman named Cordelia Vance worked as a records clerk at Ridgeline from 1921 until 1958, a 37-year tenure that began 2 years before the October 1923 discovery, and that gave her, over the following decades, an unusually intimate familiarity with the institution's documentary history. Cordelia gave an extended interview in 1989, 31 years after her retirement and 66 years after the discovery, to a regional oral history project, an interview that stands today as the single most important surviving first-hand account of what actually happened at Ridgeline in 1923, because Cordelia, unlike Reeves, unlike the county board, had spent the better part of 4 decades quietly trying to identify the 11 people whose remains had been found. "I was young when it happened," she said, in the 1989 interview, "and I didn't think much of it at first, beyond what everyone in the building was already saying, that it was strange, that the superintendent seemed very eager to have it over with. It wasn't until years later, when I'd been working in the records office long enough to really understand what was and wasn't in our files, that I started to understand how strange it actually was." Cordelia described spending portions of her career, beginning in the early 1930s and continuing intermittently for the next 2 decades, quietly cross-referencing whatever fragmentary admission records survived from the 1900 to 1915 period, against any unusual gaps or discrepancies she could identify. Patients whose files simply stopped, whose discharge was recorded without a corresponding receiving facility, whose presence in the institution was documented in one ledger but absent from another. What Cordelia found, over those decades of careful, unofficial research, conducted largely on her own time, was a pattern that she described in the 1989 interview with evident and long-held frustration. She identified, by her own count, 14 separate cases between 1900 and 1915, in which a patient's institutional record simply stopped. No death certificate, no discharge record, no transfer documentation, just an absence where a continuation should have been. 14 cases against 11 sets of remains found in 1923, close enough in number, she argued, that at least some overlap seemed probable, though she was careful, even 66 years later, to say that she had never been able to prove a direct connection between any specific name on her list and any specific set of remains. She did, however, have a theory about what had happened during that 15-year window, a theory she developed gradually over her decades of research, and that she presented, in the 1989 interview, not as a certainty, but as the most coherent explanation she had been able to construct from the available fragments. Ridgeline, like comparable institutions across the country during this period, faced periodic and severe overcrowding crises, particularly during the years immediately following a string of county court rulings in the early 1900s that had expanded the categories of conditions eligible for commitment. Cordelia's research suggested that during at least one, and possibly several of these crisis periods, the institution may have responded to overcrowding not through any formally documented policy, but through a quieter, informal practice. Patients who died during these periods of severe strain, whose families had no ongoing contact with the institution and were unlikely to inquire, being buried without the formal documentation that the institution's overwhelmed staff considered, at the time, a lower priority than simply managing the immediate crisis. I don't believe anyone set out to do something monstrous, Cordelia said, in the interview's most carefully worded passage. I believe what happened was smaller and sadder than that, and also, in its way, worse, because it means it could happen so easily, without anyone making a single dramatic decision to do something wrong. I believe somebody, at some point, decided that paperwork could wait, and that decision got made again, and then again, until 11 people were in the ground without their names attached to them, and nobody who made any of those individual decisions ever had to look at the whole pattern they were creating. Cordelia's research also documented something else, something she discussed only briefly in the 1989 interview, but that her notebooks, according to the archive's cataloging notes, address at greater length, a pattern in which the 14 disappearances she'd identified clustered disproportionately around two specific periods, 1903 to 1905 and 1911 to 1913, both of which corresponded, according to surviving state legislative records, to periods immediately following expansions of the state's involuntary commitment criteria, periods when, predictably, the population of patients arriving at institutions like Ridgeline increased sharply before any corresponding increase in staffing or capacity could be arranged. This correlation, Cordelia noted in her later research notes, was suggestive rather than conclusive, but it fit the broader pattern she had spent decades documenting across dozens of comparable institutions' histories that she had researched as a point of comparison to her own findings at Ridgeline. Overcrowding does not cause cruelty in any direct sense, she wrote, in a passage from her notebooks that the archive has transcribed and made available to researchers. But it creates the conditions under which an institution stops treating each individual person as a person requiring individual care and attention, and starts treating its population as a quantity to be managed. I believe that is what happened here, twice, in those two windows. I believe 11 people, and very likely several more whose remains have never been found at all, were the cost of an institution that had decided, however quietly and however unofficially, that managing the quantity mattered more than accounting for every person within it. Cordelia Vance retired in 1958 without ever being able to definitively close the gap between her 14 documented disappearances and the 11 sets of remains found in 1923. She continued, by her own account, to think about the case for the rest of her working life and well into her retirement. She died in 1994, 5 years after giving her interview, at the age of 91. Her research notes, kept in a series of personal notebooks she maintained outside of any official institutional record, were donated by her family to the same regional archive that holds her 1989 interview, where they remain available to researchers today, the closest thing that exists to a complete accounting of what Ridgeline's own records clerk believed, after 4 decades of careful, unofficial investigation, had actually happened. Reeves remained as superintendent until 1934, 11 years after the discovery, and his subsequent annual reports to the State Board make no further reference to the October 1923 excavation or its findings. Whether this reflects a deliberate institutional decision to treat the matter as closed, or simply the ordinary way administrative attention moves on from a resolved crisis to the next pressing concern, is not answerable from the surviving record. What is documented is that Reeves's tenure in the years following 1923 shows no evidence of the kind of record-keeping reforms that Hartwell's casebook entries suggest he believed were necessary. No expanded documentation requirements, no independent audit of historical records, nothing that would have prevented a similar gap from occurring again had similar overcrowding pressures recurred. A second, smaller discovery occurred in 1958, the same year Cordelia Vance retired, when a separate construction project on the opposite side of the property uncovered what the county's investigation at that time determined to be a single additional set of remains, in circumstances similar enough to the 1923 discovery that the investigating officer specifically referenced the earlier case in his report. This second discovery received considerably less attention than the first. By 1958, deinstitutionalization pressures were already reshaping how the state thought about its asylum system, and Ridgeline's own administration, under new leadership by that point, handled the find with what the surviving documentation describes as minimal formal process, reinterring the remains within the existing cemetery within 2 weeks and filing a report that runs to less than a single page. Cordelia Vance, in her 1989 interview, expressed particular frustration about this second discovery, which she had learned about only secondhand, after her retirement, despite having spent decades by that point trying to track exactly this kind of pattern. "I was no longer in the records office in 1958, she said. "I have always wondered what I might have found if I had still had access to the files when that second discovery happened. I have always believed the timing of my retirement, just as that occurred, was simply bad luck, and I have spent a good deal of time being angry about bad luck I had no control over, which I recognize is not a particularly productive thing to spend one's later years on, and yet." Ridgeline State Asylum closed in 1971 as part of the same statewide deinstitutionalization wave that closed comparable institutions across the broader region during this period. Its remaining patients were transferred to regional facilities, and the property, as we've discussed, has changed private ownership several times in the decades since, with the main building still standing but inaccessible, and the cemetery remaining under county and historical society stewardship. I wanted to come here myself. We're standing now at what's left of the Ridgeline property, and the asylum building itself, unlike several of the institutions we've covered on this channel, is actually still standing. It closed in 1971 and has changed ownership several times since, currently held by a private trust that maintains it but does not permit public access to the interior. What I can show you is the cemetery, which sits on land that remained in county hands and that the local historical society has maintained, with varying degrees of consistency, for the past several decades. We're standing now at what's left of the Ridgeline property, and the asylum building itself, unlike several of the institutions we've covered on this channel, is actually still standing. It closed in 1971 and has changed ownership several times since, currently held by a private trust that maintains it but does not permit public access to the interior. The drainage trench Otis Pruitt's crew was digging in October of 1923 would have run roughly along the line of trees you can see behind me, though the exact spot is no longer marked or identifiable on the ground itself. That information survives only in the written record, not in any physical trace on the property. The marker is here, the one Cordelia Vance mentioned in her interview, the one that simply reads, Unknown 1923. It's a small, plain stone, set apart somewhat from the rest of the cemetery's more individually marked graves, and standing in front of it, knowing what we now know about Cordelia's 4 decades of quiet research, it's hard not to think about the specific weight of that word. Unknown. Not because no record of these people ever existed, necessarily, but because the records that should have carried their names forward were, by someone's decision, allowed to simply stop. The regional archive that holds Cordelia's notebooks has, in recent years, begun working with a small team of volunteer genealogists, attempting to pick up where she left off, using digitization tools and genealogical databases that weren't available during her lifetime, to try to close the gap between her 14 names and the 11 remains. As of this recording, they have been able to establish a plausible match for 3 of the 14, enough to confirm that at least some of Cordelia's theory holds, not enough to give all 11 people in that shared grave their names back. I spoke with one of those volunteer genealogists, a woman named Renee Castellano, before making this trip. She's been working on the Ridgeline case for 6 years, part of a small, informal network of researchers across several states who specialize in exactly this kind of institutional identification work, what she described to me, with a kind of weary precision, as trying to undo 100 years of institutions deciding certain people's names didn't matter enough to write down correctly. She said the Sarah Jane Pickens case was, in her words, the good outcome, the one that makes the other 10 harder, not easier, because now you know it's possible, and it makes every name you can't confirm feel like more of a failure rather than less. Renee told me that the hardest part of the work, more than the genealogical puzzle solving itself, is managing what she called the weight of almost. She described case after case where she'd find a plausible match, a name that fit the timeline, a family story that hinted at an unexplained absence, a commitment record with the right gap, only to have the evidence fall just short of what she considered sufficient confidence to make a formal identification. You start to feel like you owe these people more than almost, she said. But sometimes almost is genuinely all the record will ever give you, and you have to decide whether to say so anyway, imperfectly, or to stay silent, because silence feels more responsible. I don't always know which choice is right. I just know that staying silent is what got us here in the first place. She also told me something that I think belongs in this account, specifically because it complicates the story in an important way. Renee said that in the course of her research, she had found at least 2 cases among Cordelia's original 14 that she now believes were not connected to the 1923 discovery at all. Patients whose records genuinely had simply been lost through ordinary administrative carelessness, unconnected to any pattern of deliberate or even systematically negligent unmarked burial. Cordelia was working with less information than we have now, Renee said. Some of what she flagged as suspicious probably was just bad record-keeping, the boring, common kind that doesn't hide anything except itself. I think it's important to say that, because the temptation with a story like this is to assume everything unexplained is sinister, and sometimes the truth is just that people were careless, which is its own kind of failure, but a different one. One of those 3 confirmed matches deserves to be named here, because giving even one of these 11 people their identity back is, in a real sense, the entire point of telling this story at all. In 2017, a volunteer genealogist working from Cordelia's notebooks was able to establish, through a combination of county court records, a surviving family Bible, and a single newspaper death notice that had been misfiled for decades in an unrelated archive box, that one of the 14 names on Cordelia's list very likely corresponded to a woman named Sarah Jane Pickens, committed to Ridgeline in 1904 at the age of 19, following what her commitment record describes as violent religious mania, and whose institutional trail, consistent with Cordelia's research, simply stops in the surviving records sometime in early 1905. Sarah Jane Pickens had a younger sister, Maddie, who lived until 1979, and who, according to a brief mention in a local newspaper's Looking Back column from 1975, had spent much of her own adult life believing that her sister had been transferred to a different facility sometime in the mid-1900s and had simply lost touch with the family afterward, a belief that, the genealogist's research suggests, the family had constructed and maintained for decades in the absence of any other explanation, because the alternative, that Sarah Jane had died at Ridgeline and never been properly accounted for, was apparently never presented to them as a possibility by the institution itself. Maddie Pickens died 4 years before the genealogical match was made. She never learned, so far as researchers have been able to determine, what had actually happened to her sister. Her own children and grandchildren, however, were contacted in 2018 when the match was confirmed, and according to the Regional Archive's own records of the outreach, the family requested and received permission to have Sarah Jane's name formally added to a supplementary marker placed near the original, unknown 1923 stone, the first of what the archive hopes will eventually be 11 individual names restored to a grave that for 95 years held none. I'll leave you with Cordelia Vance's own words from the very end of her 1989 interview, when she was asked what she hoped would happen to her research after she was gone. She said, "I hope somebody keeps looking. I was only one woman with a desk drawer and whatever hours I could steal from my actual job. Somebody with real resources, real time, could finish what I started. I would like, before I die, for those 11 people to have their names back. I don't think I'm going to get that, but I would like someone to keep trying after I'm not able to anymore." Cordelia Vance died 5 years after saying those words. The marker still reads, Unknown, 1923. And the volunteers working through her notebooks today are doing, in their own way, exactly what she asked. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you, stick around. There are more forgotten stories like this one, waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next one.